Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this scope in the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss a United Nations Security Council meeting that was called for by the United States because the U.S. wants the arms embargo that is about to expire in October on Iran. That arms embargo is set to expire. All of this, of course, in context of the nuclear deal, which the U.S. walked away from itself. The U.S. says that Iran is still very much a threat to the region and the world, and that is why this arms embargo must be extended indefinitely. So the U.S. does not want another temporary extension of this arms embargo deal, which would at some point expire in the future. But Pompeo said that very clearly at the Security Council that he wants this to be an indefinite extension of the arms embargo until Iran essentially comes into line. Of course, I'm paraphrasing his words. And now, of course, there's a lot to discuss here, but it seems that the Security Council members, the most important ones, that is China and Russia, expectedly are against this, but even the likes of Germany and others were not totally on board, especially, again, as I said, in the context of the fact that the U.S. has already decided to walk away from this deal early on in the Trump tenure as first-term president. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Karl Kaltenthaler, who is professor and director of security studies at the University of Akron. He's joining us now from Akron, Ohio. Karl, thank you for your time this morning. What do you make of how that Security Council meeting went, about the likelihood of this arms embargo actually coming into place?
Well, I think it's very easy to say that this arms embargo will not come into place. One, because of Russian and Chinese disagreement with it, but really the United States has no real backing on this. The United States is really in a position where it is essentially isolated itself politically. It's made an argument that it can pull out of the agreement with Iran on the development of nuclear weapons, but at the same time have the stipulations of that agreement. So it's kind of one of those have your cake and eat it too situations. And our allies even have said, you can't do that. You can't pull out of this. You can't undermine all the work we've done on this. The arms embargo, the arms agreement would have worked otherwise. You pulled out of it, and now you're trying to punish Iran for gaining weapons that are not seen as potentially destabilizing or game changers or something like that.
So then why then do you think the Trump administration is sticking with this line then, Karl, at this point? Because, you know, this has been the one thing that Donald Trump seems to have been consistent on, i.e. The nuclear deal, his hatred for it from day one, even as candidate before he came into the White House, and secondly, him walking away from it. As in, you know, the Iran policy seems to have been, at least from the outside, fairly consistent.
Yeah, so, I mean, this actually fits into the way that the Trump administration looks at Iran. The Trump administration doesn't look at Iran as an issue simply because Iran has the potential to develop nuclear weapons. The Trump administration looks at Iran as a problem for the United States' allies because of Iran's support of proxy groups, for example, militias in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon. Its support for groups that are considered threats to Saudi Arabia, such as the Houthis in Yemen. These kinds of things are looked at by the United States as, well, by the Trump administration, as significant threats to American national security interests. So the nuclear part of this relationship with Iran is only a small part of it. The United States is trying to change the behavior of Iran in a much more comprehensive fashion to get Iran to do basically things that Iran's probably very loath to do. And its goal is really to make Iran no longer a regional player in the Middle East, and particularly not make it a threat to the United States' allies, at least from the perception of those allies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, for example.
And, you know, I wonder how much this has damaged. I mean, we already know, of course, U.S.-Iran relations are that of essentially adversaries from the moment the revolution took place back in '79. But then along with the hostage crisis, et cetera, we can obviously list many things over the years. But do you think that this has beyond repair damaged those relations, even if, hypothetically speaking, of course, Biden were to win at the end of this year?
I think relations would improve significantly if Biden were to win. But when I say significantly, I mean that the United States and Iran would not be in a posture where they could potentially be coming to blows with weapons. The United States and Iran have been in a very, very precarious position vis-a-vis each other over the last year plus. You've seen exchanges through proxies or even American direct action in Iraq, in the Gulf. There's definitely a very high level of tension. That tension will ratchet down if Biden were to win, but it certainly wouldn't create a normalized relationship between Iran and the United States. There's too many factors against that. One is just domestic politics in the United States. Domestic politics in the United States would make it very, very difficult to create a normalized relationship with Iran. And I think domestic politics in Iran, people can't forget that, would make it next to impossible for Iran to have a normalized relationship with the United States.
And then the fact that, as you mentioned as well, a lot of U.S. allies themselves, even at the Security Council, such as Germany, stands out, do not agree with the U.S. when it comes to the nuclear deal and how it's treated it. What does that mean then for the U.S. standing in Europe, for example, and for the future of those relations, possibly?
Well, I think the U.S. standing in Europe, with a few exceptions, is not very good right now. I mean, if you look at public opinion polls, United States, Trump in particular, is very unpopular in Europe. Like I said, with exceptions, the exceptions would be a country like Poland, where the U.S. and Trump is fairly popular. But in Western Europe, among our major allies, our standing has diminished substantially. And I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing this public pushback, is that it's not a political loser to go against the United States anymore. In fact, countries' leaders have an incentive, many of them in Western Europe, to stand up to Trump, to stand up to what's seen as really unjustified American positions on Iran. That's kind of the standard view that's held in Western Europe, that these are not fair positions on Iran, and it makes sense for countries to say, look, what's most important is to get Iran to commit to a non-nuclear future, and the United States is actually making that harder rather than easier with its present set of policies. And so it doesn't really surprise me that you're seeing pushback from our allies the way that we're seeing now.
And, the nuclear deal was sold to all of us. For Iranians, it was sold to them that they would get economic benefits, which, arguably they did not enjoy as much once the deal even came into effect, quote unquote. But on the other side, for the rest of the world, it was meant to create a safer world, right? A world with less threats, such as those perceived threats from Iran. Now with talk from the U.S. officials of even possibly trying to force through the snapback mechanism within that nuclear deal, do you think we're now entering even more dangerous territory?
Yeah, I mean, I think Iran, when pushed into a corner, is going to react. The Iranian economy is in a very precarious position right now. The sanctions have been devastating for them. The pressure on them not to acquire weapons that they feel they need. The Iranian military has actually got a very antiquated set of weapon systems. They feel like they do need to modernize. They view that they're in a threatening neighborhood. So, from the Iranian perspective, they're going to try to pressure the United States to change its policies. And one of the areas where we've seen the Iranians try to change American policies is in Iraq. Iraq's Shia militias have attacked American forces, and that's part and parcel of the Iranian strategy to try to, one, get the United States to leave Iraq, but two, to also say, look, we won't take your pressure without reacting. We will respond. And so, another area that we could see potential Iranian response is in Saudi Arabia. They could attack oil facilities there. They're not going to move into a position where their economy is teetering on absolute collapse and not react to American policy.
And then as a final, I wanted to ask you about the Russia-China angle on all of this, right? Because there's no secret that the U.S. has its differences between those countries. But do you think there's potential over just Iran, for example, that those relations could get a lot worse if those countries, veto any U.S. attempt at the United Nations Security Council to bring forth an arms embargo or snap back, and secondly, then if they continue to then support Iran going forward?
I think that it is unlikely that what is going on with Iran will have a significant impact on American relations with Russia or China. And part of that is because of the dynamic of Russian and Chinese policies in the U.S. right now are driven by much bigger factors than Iran. The relationship with the United States and China right now is extremely fraught, and that is caused by a view in the Trump administration that China is a very significant national security threat to the United States. So what goes on with Iran is really not going to impact much how the Trump administration views China. China is viewed as a nefarious actor no matter what they do with Iran. Now, the question of Russia is a little bit more complicated because in some ways, the United States has kind of two Russia policies. We have the policy of Trump towards Russia, which is one that views Russia as a potential partner, one that views Putin as a man we can do business with, to kind of put words in the mouth of the administration. And then there's the view from the intelligence community in the United States, the Pentagon, and most of the national security establishment in the United States that views Russia as very threatening. And so push back against this view of Russia as being, if not malevolent, benevolent, held by Trump, has been pretty significant. And I don't think Iran is going to change the views of those in the national security establishment in the U.S. that view Russia as problematic, and it's not going to view Trump's view that Putin is someone he can do business with.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your time this morning. That was Karl Kaltenthaler speaking to us there from Akron in Ohio. They were speaking there, of course, about what's happened in the Security Council vis-a-vis the U.S. efforts to at least have a debate on a possible arms embargo indefinitely put in place against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, all of this, again, as I put in my introduction, in context of the fact that the U.S. has walked away from the nuclear deal and has done so a significant while back. Even U.S. allies now saying you can't just come in to the Security Council now and demand an indefinite arms embargo. The arms embargo, the temporary one, is set to expire in October of this year itself. The Chinese and the Russians, of course, as traditional allies of Iran, are standing by. But even now, the Germans have spoken up and have sided with the Chinese and the Russians, saying that the U.S. can't do this. And of course, other U.S. allies have said the same. Also, what does this then mean about the U.S. attempts to get its way when it comes to Iran in international fora? Will it lose out when it comes to this Trump policy, which, as I put to Karl, has remained fairly consistent, though it has failed so far, seemingly, at least if we're looking from the outside in. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Islamophobia, but through an interesting context. We've had two Trump appointees at important U.S. agencies and positions. One is at USAID, also known as the U.S. Agency for International Development. Mark Kevin Lloyd has been appointed as a religious freedom advisor. Now, we also have had an appointment as an Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Department of Defense, Brigadier General retired Anthony Tata. Now, both of these gentlemen, both Lloyd and Tata, have had troubling posts in the past on social media where they've spoken of Islam in not very good terms and have come out quite honestly, if we're honest, with very Islamophobic posts as well. Now, those posts have been deleted, if we're completely fair and honest to these gentlemen, and they may very well have changed their views in the ensuing time. However, it is still troubling that Donald Trump has appointed these two gentlemen to their respective positions. What does that say about his appointments and his ready views then when it comes to Muslims and Islam. And Muslims, of course, make up an important minority within the United States as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by Denari Duffner, who is a scholar of Muslim-Christian relations and Islamophobia. She's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Also joining us from D.C. this morning is Shahed Amanullah, who is a former senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State. Shahed and Jordan, good morning to you both. Jordan, let me start with you. It strikes one as very odd, doesn't it, that you would have somebody like Lloyd appointed as the religious freedom advisor at USAID with the kind of background that he's had and the kind of opinions that he has about Islam. I mean, that sort of seems like it defeats the very purpose, doesn't it?
It does. At the same time, this reflects a pattern in the Trump administration of appointing people with anti-Muslim views or people who've worked with anti-Muslim organizations in the past. I could go through a list of individuals who the Trump administration has appointed who reflect these kinds of anti-Muslim views. And they're not too different from views that President Trump himself has advanced all the way back to his first presidential run back in 2012, when he talked about this birther conspiracy with President Obama, leading the American public to believe that President Obama was a Muslim, which, of course, in his view was not an innocuous quality. It was seen as something that was threatening. And so the fact that individuals like Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Tata have been appointed is troubling, but not all that surprising given Donald Trump's record.
Shahed, what do you make of this? Because again, I mean, Tata, Under Secretary of Defense, that's one thing, but to have a religious freedom advisor, I mean, by definition, seems pretty hypocritical to have somebody who has an anti-religion view of any religion.
Well, it just shows you how toxic it is for anyone to want to work for this administration. He's really scraping the bottom of the barrel and really now just going after people who clearly are unqualified. We've had a tradition in federal government where there's at least a baseline of competency, regardless of whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. And particularly with respect to religious freedom, there are good people in government who care about this issue. I mean, it's almost like a prerequisite to be in that space. What this shows is that he just wants to fill the seat. He wants to fill it with someone who's loyal to him. And he just genuinely doesn't care about the qualifications or lack thereof. And so what I think, unfortunately, if someone were to espouse these views on social media, if they were running for political office, they would be shamed out of their office. And thankfully, we've seen that happen many, many times. But when you're talking about political appointments, they kind of happen under the radar. So I think it's important for organizations, individuals like Joe Biden, to make this known so that that shame that you would get if you're a political appointee, running for political office, is also cast here, and that people understand that there's a baseline that we will not go below.
George, I imagine, and I believe Lloyd, if I'm not mistaken, has sent a letter, apologizing or expressing regret, I believe it is, to Congress members, if I'm not mistaken. I read that somewhere today. We can possibly imagine that at least one or both of these gentlemen possibly do regret their previous stances and may very well have reformed their views. I mean, in that case, then how would one approach this in a reasonable fashion?
I mean, I think we need to hear those apologies publicly. I haven't seen that statement yet, and I would welcome it if I would welcome that. I think the key is to make sure that any person appointed to one of these positions is living out what they say that their views are, and making sure that they're not just trying to get in the door and make sure that they're credentials are up to snuff and that they can pass sort of the media test before they get into office, but that once they're actually fulfilling their roles in these positions, that they're living up to that. And I hope that these individuals have renounced their anti-Muslim views and that they push others in the Trump administration to move in the same direction.
Shahed, I wonder, how does one work that out? So if somebody even expresses regret, right, does that automatically mean that they actually regret their actions? Because that very well could be because they were appointed in whatever respective position, right? So it seems that Lloyd and Tata both went back the moment they were nominated to these respective positions and then started deleting these social media posts. That sort of just seems like it was done at a convenient time, right?
I'll tell you why I don't think that their apologies are genuine. So when someone is appointed to a position like this, usually they're the first to know. And usually the first thing people will do is go through their social media posts and delete things before they're noticed. What seems clear to me is that they didn't think that these posts were worthy of deletion before someone else found out they were being appointed, searched through their social media, and found those posts. So it tells me that even up to that point of being appointed, they simply didn't think it was a big deal for them to espouse views like that. So that's why I don't believe that their apologies are genuine. I think they're just simply sorry that they were caught.
Yeah, and then on that point, Jordan, both of these gentlemen are in extremely influential positions, right? So, I mean, in USAID, we know has its hands and feet in many areas around the world, and possibly does some very, very good work around the world as well. However, to have a religious freedom advisor with anti-Islam views, possibly even, going to Muslim countries, A, is just a troubling thought. And then B, to even have an undersecretary of defense who has, troubling views about Islam, where the U.S. is involved so heavily in the Middle East, is also troubling, right? I mean, what do you think is the foreign policy, effect on all this?
Well, it definitely doesn't send a good message. I don't think it will surprise many folks in Muslim majority countries or American Muslims to know that there are people in the Trump administration who have espoused these sorts of views. But it doesn't send a good message, and it's quite hypocritical and ironic. It would be funny if it weren't so serious that someone who espouses these kinds of views about Muslims and Islam is purportedly a religious freedom advisor in this sort of U.S. agency. It doesn't send a good message.
What are your thoughts, Shahed? Because you've been at the Department of State, and I wonder, within such departments and ministries, really, if we're honest, and we'd call them like that around the world, to have people like this serving abroad, that's troubling, right? Because then those views then will affect policy making, won't it?
Yeah, so both these institutions engage with Muslims at a very kind of close level on the ground in places around the world. And even if you don't like Muslims, to appoint people like this would simply get in the way of you doing your job. So even at a rational level, of a logistical level of just getting the job done, these people fail that test because they then become the issue that you have to overcome in order to do the basic functions of each of your jobs. So it's really honestly weird that an appointment like this will be made and not immediately withdrawn. It just tells me that the functioning of these ministries are just not being taken seriously from the top. And I feel very bad for my former colleagues who are good people who are struggling in these institutions and are just chafing at the bit at the idea that they would have to respond or report to people like this. I mean, it makes them want to quit. And frankly, we can't have them. We can't have the last sane people in these departments quitting.
All right, we're now joined by Arsalan Iftikhar, who is a human rights lawyer and founder of the MuslimGuy.com. He's joining us now this morning from Washington, D.C. to continue our discussion about the appointments there of USAID, the Religious Freedom Advisor, Mark Lloyd, as well as the advisor or the Undersecretary of Defense nomination, for policy in the Department of Defense, General Tata. Both of these, of course, Trump appointees with troubling social media posts about Islam in the past. Arsalan, thank you for your time this morning and for joining us. What do you make of the statements of both Lloyd and Tata in the past, Islamophobic statements, quite obviously? Their removal, as the moment that came out into the open, can they still serve in their respective positions and not have those Islamophobic views affect how they do their jobs?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be sort of put into context, Waqar, is the fact that this is obviously a long line of Islamophobic appointments by the Trump administration and by Donald Trump himself. I mean, let's not forget that Donald Trump was a president who, during his own candidacy, said that I think Islam hates us in an interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper. He actually started the 2011 birther controversy against Barack Obama, saying that maybe Barack is not releasing his birth certificate because it says that he's a Muslim. Even before Mark Kevin Lloyd and Tata, he has surrounded himself with a litany of Islamophobic advisors like Stephen Bannon, who once said that Islam is not a religion of peace, or Sebastian Gorka, who said that violence is a fundamental part of Islam, or even his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who once said that Islam is like a cancer. So, obviously this is just part and parcel of what's going on in the Trump administration today, even at the lowest levels like, Mark Kevin Lloyd and Tata. It's obviously, with Mark Kevin Lloyd, serving as a religious freedom advisor who is disparaging the second largest religion on the face of the earth, and Tata, who is operating in the Defense Department. It's obviously very troubling because of the fact that both USAID and the Pentagon deal very much with Muslim majority nations. Since out of the 196 countries on earth, 57 of them are Muslim majority nations. And so obviously it doesn't do much to build any sort of trust between the United States right now and the Muslim world, and really the greater international community at large as well.
Indeed. So, I mean, that to my next question about policy making, right? Because especially when we're talking about the Pentagon, one would imagine that even though General Tata is would just be the Undersecretary of Defense, that's still a significant position. I mean, he would still have a lot of people answering under him, and secondly, he would have a lot of influence over policies. Does all of this affect then how the U.S. Creates those policies for the Middle East, for example, where it is heavily, of course, involved?
I don't think so. Again, this is not the first time that the Pentagon has had Islamophobic officials. I mean, even during the administration of George W. Bush after 9/11, we dealt with a lot of undersecretaries. William Boykin was one of them, who was the undersecretary for policy as well, and was caught on video making very disparaging comments about Islam and Muslims during presentations at churches that he went to. And so sadly, this is something that we've become used to, how much influence these people have. I'm less worried about, some no-name undersecretaries that I am national security advisors who are in the West Wing, Steve Bannon, who was the, chief political strategist. I mean, these are the people who have Trump's ear on a daily, if not hourly basis. And so, like I said, it literally shows that Islamophobia has become completely foundational to the Trump administration, and more importantly, to the Republican Party writ large today. Oftentimes people forget that even though Donald Trump was elected president, when he was running for office, when he was in the Republican primary, there were 16 other Republican candidates who were running against him, and they were all trying to out-Islamophobe each other. You had people like former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who said that, Sharia law is a mortal threat to the United States. You had people like Ben Carson, who are now serving in the Trump administration, who said that he would never appoint a Muslim or a Hindu as a federal judge, for that matter. The racism and xenophobia has become part and parcel of the Republican Party today. And it's important for us to call it out when we do see it with people like Tata or Mark Kevin Lloyd. But sadly, it's no longer a surprise to anyone who operates here in the Beltway.
So then how does one overcome, right? Because certainly Donald Trump can't do all of the above or wouldn't have gone down this path, this Islamophobic path, if he didn't know that his base supported him when it comes to those views.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Waqar. And I think the key is, again, to keep media pressure. The more coverage there is on people like Tata, Kevin Lloyd, obviously Sebastian Gorka and Bannon are no longer there because of the pressure, right? Because of all the coverage of their racist Islamophobic statements. The more coverage there is, I'll be honest with you. Religious freedom advisor to USAID is a no-name position. Again, 99% of Americans could not name a religious advisor to USAID, but because it's been in the spotlight, in the media, airwaves, for the last couple of weeks, hopefully it puts pressure on internal bureaucrats. What you hope is that sort of lifelong civil servants within USAID, within the Pentagon, will convince them to have cooler heads prevail and remove these nominations. I'm not holding my breath with anything that comes from the Trump administration, but again, the longer it remains in the zeitgeist, the longer that it remains, in the news cycle, I think the more likely we are to get some sort of pushback. Obviously, because of the fact that nobody wants to be called a racist, even though our president is a racist. But nobody wants to be called that. And so I think that the more pressure that we put on the administration through this media coverage. I mean, Trump likes nothing more than positive media coverage. And so, and that's the key to this, is that when he sees this sort of, negative meta narratives, not only against him, but his administration for being xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, these are the things that hopefully will, cause some change.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there at that, Arsalan, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to speak to us this morning. That was Arsalan Iftikhar speaking to us this morning from Washington, D.C. Now, viewers, we've spoken to 3 guests so far, Jordan, Arsalan, and Shahed, and all of them spoke to us about how this is not a surprise, really, these appointments coming in a line of such appointees, I should say, and nominations by the Trump administration ever since Trump has come into office in the White House, of those with troubling views about Islam in the past and even really presently held. As Shahed there had put in his earlier answers as well, it's interesting that a lot of that both Lloyd and Tata chose to remove their social media posts, Islamophobic ones, after they were nominated and after those nominations became public, because as he said, the process is that these people are told from before it is made public that they are nominated for those respective positions, which makes sense, of course. So the fact that they only chose to remove these posts once it became public and a problem for them to then be confirmed into their respective positions probably says a lot about what their real views presently are about Islam. And then what does that then say about how they will then act with Muslims as a religious freedom advisor to USAID or as Undersecretary of State as well at the Department of Defense? Those are troubling, of course, questions to ask. But then as Arsalan contextualized it for us, these are not necessarily very, very significant positions, but nevertheless, it's a long line of nominations and otherwise the Trump administration has made in regards to those who have Islamophobic views. I'll be back with my last segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss a Human Rights Watch report which has come out, essentially asking Canada to bring home those who are suspected of being members of ISIS and their relatives from the camps that they found themselves in Syria. Now, there are around 47 Canadians, including 26 children, who have found themselves in these camps, and certainly one can possibly imagine that these camps are not really in very good conditions. The conditions are dire by any definition. So Human Rights Watch is saying essentially the Canadian government is not doing its part, is not providing consular access, is not fulfilling its international obligations towards its own citizens. At this time, even those who are minors. We have this one orphan child, Amira, I believe her name is, who Human Rights Watch has spoken of and other human rights groups have spoken of and said that Canada should bring back that orphan child at the very least, as well as the other children, many of whom have been orphaned because parents were possibly, Canadian parents that is, were possibly members of ISIS and may have fought in Syria and or Iraq. What is the role of Canada this time? Because it's certainly not easy, one can imagine, on the part of any government to be able to go into a place like northern Syria and to bring out their respective citizens from those sorts of areas. And then how does one deal with them once they are back in Canada if they genuinely are alleged to be members of ISIS? You would need to have some sort of mechanism in place to be able to do that in countries like Canada, etc. Let's put all of that to our expert guest who is joining us this morning from Ottawa. We're joined by John Packer, who is a member of Human Rights Watch's Canada Committee. He's also a Newberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution and Director of Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. John, thank you very much for your time this morning. What do you make of this report? I mean, Canada essentially being called out like other countries were called out, right? So we've had the UK, for example, called out in the past about Shamima Begum. You must have heard of that case as well and how it has chosen to deal with that situation with her. What's the right answer here? It seems like it seems tougher than what just comes on the outside.
Well, there's no doubt that this kind of situation presents a number of complications and really is a reflection of the kind of complex, interdependent world we're living in now, where there were literally thousands of nationals or citizens of other countries who responded to a call or of their own volition went to join ISIS. And now we have this kind of fallout with all the human tragedy that it entails. You mentioned the children, who obviously didn't go or make a choice or participate in anything. Most of them, by the way, of the 26 children are actually under the age of 6. So we're talking about toddlers and infants. So it's a complicated matter. But there is both legal obligations, including pursuant to United Nations Security Council resolution, and a whole alliance of states that are supposed to be cooperating in this regard. And I think Human Rights Watch has basically called Canada out for not playing its part.
And so what does that need to do then? Because, Canada finds itself in a position where it does not have diplomatic relations right now with the current Syrian government, that is the government of Bashar al-Assad. And so the Canadians are saying, listen, we don't have an embassy in Damascus right now, a functioning embassy, at least in Damascus right now. So this makes it that much harder for us to then just go in and have our citizens come out.
Well, that's only a small part of the problem, and Canada is not unique in that regard. I mean, there are 20 other states that have so far successfully had their nationals taken out, and that's actually what the Security Council resolution, by the way, a resolution explicitly adopted under Chapter 7, which means binding obligation on states. So this is not, like normally one would say these are Canadian nationals who voluntarily went abroad, and that's their risk. Never mind the humanitarian and the moral issues around children and families in the conditions that you mentioned. But here we have a binding resolution of the Security Council, which urges states actively to cooperate and explicitly speaks about the provision of consular services, of cooperation on judicial mechanisms. The problem is, how does the international community actually stop or diminish the kind of risk associated with these terrorist groups? Now, Canada doesn't have an embassy in Damascus, and by the way, the country is not fully under the control of Damascus. In fact, these specific people are in the northeast part under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces. So this is not, that's not the issue. The issue is if these persons could be brought to, or Canadian consular services could be accessible to, and the answer of both of those questions is yes, it is possible, then what would Canada do? And that's, the real question right now is Canada making an effort?
I wonder if possibly the nervousness on the part of the Trudeau government is because of what they may think the Canadians, like the Canadian public, would feel about having ISIS members brought back, or alleged ISIS members, of course, that would need to be proven in a court of law, but alleged ISIS members and their family members being brought back to Canada. I mean, I don't know, I'm just going back to another case, not necessarily very much similar, but Omar Khadr, and the way he's been viewed by a lot of Canadians ever since he's served his time and is now not completely free, but free in some regards. I mean, there's not a lot of positive talk about the way that's been handled.
No, that's absolutely right. And there's no doubt that Mr. Trudeau and his government, particularly in a minority position, and at these unsettled times in which we're living in, moreover, is not relishing the idea of either getting involved or actually repatriating, particularly the adults. And by the way, we really should here distinguish, because there's not only the question of legal obligation, but the humanitarian issue here. I think it's extremely important to distinguish the 8 men who appears went of their own volition or allegedly joined ISIS, and depending on what they did and so forth. That would be in breach of law. That's breach of Canadian law too, by the way. So that's one question, and some of the women. But the rest who are not alleged to have done anything. And that's Canada has successfully brought back 40,000 nationals from 100 countries related to COVID-19 at enormous expense to the country. But we're being kind of coy about this number of people. And sure, it's because the government, and Trudeau in particular, is calculating this will not be popular. I'm sure is not popular with public sentiments. These are complicated issues. And this is where a responsible government under international law and in cooperation for anti-terrorism has to make these difficult choices.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, John, but I sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule this morning to share your expert thought with us on this very complex issue, as you put it as well. And certainly one can understand even from the outside end, it's not as simple as just going in and taking your citizens out and coming back, especially in such a situation such as Syria, where the Syrian government doesn't necessarily have control over all of the country, and then you have different forces having control over the northern Syria. as well as, of course, then the fact that there are political realities on the ground, which the Trudeau government does need to take into account. Nevertheless, as John there had said, international laws, UN resolutions do exist, giving the responsibility to governments such as Canada to repatriate their citizens, even those who have been accused of being alleged or have been alleged to be ISIS members. That would all need to be proven, of course, in a court of law. And their children certainly have no fault in this. If they're Canadian citizens, they should be brought back, and especially those who are orphan children as well. So this is complex, but Canada needs to do the right thing according to international law. Will it do the right thing? For now, the Canadian defense is we just can't do it because we don't have access to these people. We don't have consular relations, right, or diplomatic relations, I should say, with the Syrians at this point in time. So how on earth are we supposed to go in and do this at this time? But as John there laid out, it is very much possible. So we'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.